and record here. Great, so welcome everybody. Thank you to everyone who has made it out tonight. And we're discussing that hopefully this recording will sort of have a life of its own. So welcome to everybody who takes the time to watch this later on. We're really excited about this conversation. Let me begin by introducing myself and the host of this organization. So I'm Chris Sheklian, and I'm the director of what's called the Zorab Information Center, which is a library and kind of presentation space that's attached to the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America in New York. As the Zorab Center has been doing for many years, we have what are called enrichment evenings. And my tiny little innovation since taking over the directorship has been to try to have kind of thematic series over seasons. And as an academic, they're still several years later, they're like semesters in my brain. But of course, they're just fall and spring seasons. The idea that I had here was to do a series on basically, specifically Armenians, but thinking today, obviously, thinking about Armenian Christianity and anti-racism. Now, of course, everybody is, clearly aware of all of the events, George Floyd's killing that sort of sparked the way that a lot of people have been sort of taking this up in a way that, perhaps many of us are late to the game, we can say, to be thinking about this topic. But it's clearly been a galvanizing and important issue for everybody in America. And that's true no matter who you are or what your point of view is. And, I'll just say that in the relative immediate aftermath of George Floyd's killing, Armenians did take up this question. And there were a number of really wonderful and important things that came from Armenian perspectives, thinking about the question of race and racism. But what I'm hoping to do is to put a bit of a Armenian Christian spin on it. Some churches hosted some of these events, but none of those previous events really were specifically thinking through the lens of Christianity and of Armenian Christianity. And so that's what I wanted to do with this series, because I think there's a really important place for the church as an institution to be thinking about this. Now, over the course of that led me to our event this evening, which is to say that, Armenian Christians, as everybody ought to know, but if you don't know, you're going to get a bit of it tonight, are not alone in the world of Christianity, but have what we generally call our sister churches in the Oriental Orthodox world. And actually, there's been a really wonderful group that we'll hear more about later that is called the Oriental Orthodox Solidarity Project, that has been thinking about how all the different Oriental Orthodox churches might come together to think about basically, a kind of anti-racist position and solidarity within America and our experience as Oriental Orthodox churches together in America. So that's what tonight's conversation is going to do a little bit of as well. So we're calling it Oriental Orthodox Christianity and the problem of racism, which is to say, what is that problem from the perspective of all of these different Oriental Orthodox churches? And what is, what might a response from the Oriental Orthodox churches look like? And that's the question that we want to take up. And, there have been a little bit of thought about that, but it's exciting to bring some voices together to think in this platform. And I'm really excited to do so. And so I am going to begin by introducing my co-panelists. So we're conceiving of this as a conversation between voices from a few of the different Oriental Orthodox churches. And each of us are going to kind of give a little bit of background about the churches that we are involved with. And then we're going to have a conversation together about what might Oriental Orthodoxy then look like, to go from our individual churches to those groups of sister churches. So, I suspect most of us here are familiar with what those Oriental Orthodox churches are, but maybe it's worth to just sort of, be clear about what we're talking about, right? So I know that I've got some of my usual Armenian friends of the Zorab Center, but I've got a lot of other folks here. And so maybe it's worth just sort of being clear about this, right? So this is just off my brain in no particular order. What are usually the most common names given are the Armenian Church, the Coptic Church, the Syriac Church, the Ethiopian, as well as the Eritrean Church, and what's usually called the Syro-Malankaren Church. There's different names for these, and I'm sure I've picked the wrong ones from different people's perspectives. But those are the names that I usually use when I write them down. And there are different divisions within them, and we'll talk about some of these issues. But maybe it's good to just sort of put those out together. And technically speaking, all of these churches are what are called in communion with each other, which means quite literally that we could go take communion in each other's churches simply by being baptized in our respective churches. And furthermore, we've got a couple deacons here on the panel, or priests. One could co-celebrate liturgies together is another thing that communion means. Now, of course, I have no idea how to participate in the Gez rite, so I would not be a very effective deacon on the altar there. But theologically speaking, that's what that communion entails. So that's maybe a big overview for those of us that are maybe not totally familiar with what these sister churches are and what they're doing. And you'll get a lot more of a few of them. So let me introduce my fellow panelists, and then we'll go through here a little bit. So I have with me today Deacon Henok Elias of the Gez Rite, who alongside his liturgical and homiletical duties is an elementary school educator, translator, editor, and writer who holds a master's degree in dispute resolution from Pepperdine University School of Law, the most beautiful school on the planet. He has a peer-reviewed article on race in the Journal of the California Caucus of College and University Ombuds, and he hosts a podcast on Semitic scriptural interpretation and another podcast that highlights multi-ethnic converts to the Afro-Asiatic Orthodox Christian communion. He'll be our first speaker, but I'll go ahead and also introduce Candace Lukasik, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. She earned her PhD in sociocultural anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. I have to say go Bears here because I did my undergraduate at Berkeley. Based on 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork between Egypt and the United States, her first book project that she's working on now explores the transnational circulation of political subjectivities and religious practices through the lens of Coptic Orthodox Christian emigration. She's received a number of grants to help support this work. You can read more about that on the Zorab Information Center's website to see all of the wonderful things. And I should say, Candace and I are both involved in a project on Orthodox Christianity and human rights that is organized through Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Studies Center. So in addition to having our Berkeley connection, we've worked together on that as well. So these are my co-panelists who are amazing and brilliant and wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what we've all been arguing who's going to speak the least because we think that the others are going to say the most exciting things. So I'm really thrilled to hear from everybody. So as I said, just quickly again, the format basically is that each of us is going to talk in turn a little bit about our respective churches and and the question of race and racism as it pertains to our individual churches. And then we're going to have a bit of a conversation between the three of us. We've prepared some questions for each other that we're going to tackle. And then after a little bit of that, we'll open it up more to questions for those of you who are here with us tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Deacon Henok.
Thank you again for having me. Good evening to everyone in the East Coast, and good afternoon to everyone in the West Coast over here. And so he already touched on it already, but I'll get a little bit into why I use that funny term, Afro-Asiatic, and maybe could be a discussion going forward too at the end when I have a proposal of sorts for us to kind of begin having a conversation on this great subject matter which is at hand, which is the problem of racism. I was on a similar panel amongst the so-called Eastern Orthodox groups, which my esteemed colleagues also are working with in a different capacity. I love to see that ecumenical work as much as possible across so-called groups that are not in communion. He discussed how we are in communion, but we have some ecumenical dialogue on these subjects, even with people who are not in our communion. And I really focus on languages a lot. And so I think it's helpful to see the word Eastern and the word Oriental, they mean the same thing. And they're both in relation to the people who wrote that, who are in the West. So it just means east of us. They're that way. It's a little less descriptive. And so when I talk about the groups, I try to avoid also the theological polemics that have separated us for almost 2 millennia. And I like to refer to that group typically as the Greek Orthodox and us as the Afro-Asiatic Orthodox. I have some friends, one colleague actually at the Catholic University of America in DC, and another who just is a minister in the Seattle area. They like to call us pre-Chalcedonians. For those at home who don't delve into the theological controversies as much, that dates back to when we split from basically the rest of Christendom formally in 451 AD. And so not everyone knows that history. So I think it's just easier and in general to understand where we come from as the very first basis of where we come from, and from which we sprung to all of those locations that our brother just mentioned are Alexandria and Antioch. That is to say the Copts and the Syriac. From there, from the granting of what's called autocephaly or autonomy, you get our Armenia, India, or the Malankara, and then Ethiopia and Eritrea. Eritrea, I think, being the most recent in 1993. And there are a lot of ongoing issues, even around that autonomy or that autocephaly internally within our communion. The Ethiopians, we just resolved a major issue 2 years ago. The Eritreans have an ongoing issue where they're split in certain 3 ways. I know from what little I know about our Armenian brothers and sisters that there are some things about which diocese is where in terms of who's the Catholicos and who's the patriarch. And so I know that all those things haven't been resolved, but that is to say we kind of sprung forth from Alexandria and Antioch throughout Armenia, Kerala, and Aksum. And the way that we got tied to the United States is that there is this original plan during the time of the monarchy in Ethiopia, which lasted up until 1974, that you send your kids abroad, they learn, get a nice education, and they come back. So beginning, I would say, strongly in the 50s and 60s, you see Ethiopians for the first time going to Europe, going to North America to get their education, and a number of them returned. A few of them stayed, but a number of them returned. My parents are that first generation who came in the 70s. So they came a little bit later and basically got stuck. So they came in the 70s and the communist revolution happened back in Ethiopia and everything changed. After them, now you have political refugees from communism, including a lot of the people tied to the aristocracy. That regime kind of lasts till 1989 to 1991 and 1993, kind of seminal moments where those regimes fall and a new regime comes. So you have again a new wave of immigrants in the 90s, a new wave in the 2000s, and again in the 2010s. And the kind of makeup, you could say, goes from elite to more populist the earlier back in history go to now, right? It's the elites who are mostly a part of that first branch, the people most connected to the aristocracy. And so there's a different kind of feel to the socioeconomic status, to the feeling of empowerment within even the Ethiopian communities. And I want to say that even in Ethiopia, we say that we have 87 languages, which is true on its face value. And right now they have 4 working languages, which are about to be made official. You can say within the church, there are generally about 4 or 5 linguistic differences within even the Ethiopians. And if you want to talk about, genetics or ethnicity, however you want to mark that, you can say there are about 3 or 4 main groups, but then of course people have been mixing for centuries. And so that kind of adds to this complicated picture where they come to the United States and everyone had their own idea of what their ethnicity was back in Ethiopia. And here pretty much people are just Black. And they accept the kind of identity that is imbued upon them. But then there are different people who react. There are some people who come here, especially when they're born here or they live along, and they fully assimilate and they say, we are Black Americans, but we have a slightly different history because we weren't here for centuries. There are others who say, no, we're just uniquely Ethiopian. We just happen to be in America for a while. And then there are people who kind of dance between those two as it suits them, according to the situations that they find themselves in. But in my home of Los Angeles, the very first church community that began from the Watts riots that happened in the 60s. Out of that, there was a group called the Watts Prophets, which is a group of poets who gathered to have an outlet for the Black voice that was feeling oppressed in Los Angeles, which is, why the riots took place in the first place. And out of those Watts Prophets, Amdas Ion Hamilton, is a Black American, ADOS, grew up Black Catholic, actually, and converted to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church through his beatitude, Abuna Yitzhak, the famed bishop who baptizes Bob Marley and 5,000 to 7,000 other people in the Caribbean, in places like Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, all over the place. He went all over the Western Hemisphere, including the Caribbean and Canada, the United States. And so he empowered Father Amdas Ion Hamilton to form this original community in Los Angeles in communication with St. Mark's Coptic Church, which was, the first Coptic church in Los Angeles, as well as, I'm forgetting the name now, but they used to learn, because they didn't have many teachers, at the Armenian Church in Los Angeles, as well as the Coptic Church in Los Angeles. And so there was a strong kind of Afro-Asiatic communion from the beginning there. But because of all of the tumult and all of the ups and downs of the various regime changes in 1974 and in 1991 in Ethiopia, that community, which included Black Americans, Caribbean Rastafarians, and Ethiopians, basically got split up. And we had been splintering. And as I said, we just reconciled ourselves, even internally within our own community, which was divided along ethnic lines and linguistic lines just 2 years ago. And we're still, if you remember, a baby in terms of autocephaly or autonomy, because we basically got that in the 40s and the 50s, between a conversation between the last Ethiopian emperor and the Holy Synod in Alexandria, Egypt, which had been our overseers and been sending us different foreign overseers since the time of His Holiness Pope Athanasius the Great, who, for those of you who don't know, you should probably know his great work on the Incarnation and the fact that he oversaw the original canonization of the 27-book New Testament, which I know the Syriac brothers and sisters, if they're here today, do not accept the full canon. And that's a story maybe for another day. But in any event, we have to have our own sort of vision and voice. And the Ethiopian church has had three different kind of visions. His beatitude, Abuna Yitzhak, who I mentioned is the one who started the first church in Los Angeles and Jamaica and so many other places, had this vision that basically we were going to bring Ethiopian Orthodoxy to the North American shores and preach to all of the Afro-American peoples who were given Christianity alongside slavery rather than just Christianity alongside freedom. And so his voice was convert everything into English and let's serve the people here. Later on, his beatitude, Abuna Melchizedek, who's still alive, who was the spiritual advisor of the last king, His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie. He's still alive. He's around 100-something years old. Nobody knows his real birthday. A quick anecdote about him. One year we celebrated his 95th birthday. The next year they invited me again and told me it was his 91st birthday. I don't know about that. I do know my parents are in their 60s, and he was already an old man and a spiritual advisor of the king when my parents were children. So he's somewhere in his late 90s or early hundreds. He's still alive in Oakland. He's in the hospital right now, so remember him in your prayers. But his vision was, let's feed all of these Ethiopians who keep coming in, these immigrants in this 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Let's feed them and focus on Amharic language services. Let's focus on the recent immigrants rather than trying to convert or evangelize the Afro-Americans of North America and the Caribbean. Finally, you have the synod that was back in Ethiopia which basically wanted the political dissidents that were in the United States, again, mostly on ethnic politic lines and linguistic politic lines, to be one with the church back in Ethiopia and to be, accepting of basically anything the government diktats back home would be. And so this made a very complicated situation where you have these three different camps, people trying to service Black Americans, people trying to service recent Ethiopian immigrants, a lot of those immigrants being political dissidents, and then a third group that's kind of aligned with the people back home who are against the political dissidents here and supporting the government back home. It left a lot of the youth kind of confused, and people were splintered across different camps. Those haven't fully healed, but as I've said, over the past 2 years, a lot of great gains have been made. We have to give a hat tip to the current prime minister, which is itself, again, a political statement, but he was on his way here on a flight, and he's in his 40s. A lot of our bishops knew he was on his way, and they said it was shameful that a 40-year-old young man is going to be our peacemaker. And so they made their own peace as he was on his way. And so we will give him a hat tip, but we need to find our own vision, our own voice. And I think progressivism, as it is in the United States, has its own voice, its own way, anti-racism, in addressing the problem of racism. Some conservatives think that they have also addressed it as well. And without being exactly one of those things, I think we need to be in conversation with these voices and present our own voice in a myriad number of issues as they relate to the prison industrial complex, as it relates to police brutality, as well as law and order, as it relates to the foreign policy of the United States, its involvement in the wars, as it relates to the issue of the borders and immigration. How can we be embracing strangers, as it relates to the crises of houselessness or homelessness, and how we can use the gospel message to be providing housing to people in Los Angeles. I don't know if this is big in other places. Issues of occupational licensing and commercial zoning happens a lot too, where people try to be entrepreneurial on the streets, and it seems like people are disproportionately kind of abused when they try to be self-employed rather than employees of other people. And they have these low-income jobs, whether they're selling fruit on the street or whether they're selling their own cultural food on the street. A lot of these kind of pop-up shops are around our own personal church communities in South Central Los Angeles, where we have a lot of Ethiopian parishes. And finally, even issues of fiat currency, issues of abortion, all of these make us ask the question, what is the relationship between church and state? And when we ask that question, I want to remind everyone that Jesus and the apostles, they carried a sword. That sword was the word of God, and that sword was a sword of peace. And yet somehow, however peaceful they were, all of them ended up being put to death by the state, with the exception, of course, of St. John, who was banished to the island of Patmos. And so it makes us wonder, what is the relationship between church and state? What has it been like in the ancient period, the medieval period, the modern period? How are we relating to that? What sort of negative rights do we ask for? What positive rights do we ask for? I would posit that negative rights sometimes are easier to ask for. That is, it's easier to say free so-and-so from jail than incarcerate so-and-so. It's easier to say, stop murdering and beating so-and-so indiscriminately than it is to say, provide this sort of law and order in this way. But these are the conversations that are being had. And finally, another hat tip I'll give is to the Greek Orthodox Communion's Metropolitan Callistos Ware, who I've learned from a lot. If nothing else, I would encourage you all to see his introductory books to the Orthodox Church, but also his YouTube talk on salvation, in case people just want a very basic understanding of the Orthodox position on salvation. And the big thing that he said is what he calls a canonical nightmare. So the Oriental Orthodox Communion, or the Afro-Asiatic Communion, however we refer to ourselves, is how we were in Alexandria, that is to say Egypt, how we were in Antioch, that is to say Syria, how were we in Armenia, how were we in India, How were we in Ethiopia? Now we find ourselves in North America. We had separate synods, we had separate jurisdictions and dioceses because we happened to be in certain lands. Now that we're in the same place, it was Metropolitan Callistos Ware's vision for his own communion. It is my own humble vision for mine that somehow we establish a North American synod. I think the biggest issue is that we haven't been speaking each other's languages, but increasingly, the longer we spend here, the more all of us know English. I think it would make sense to have the same metropolitan, the same patriarch, the same bishops, the same ordination. What we talked about earlier was theoretically we can take communion. Theoretically, we can preach at each other's churches. Theoretically, we can address issues like racism together. But how often are we actually doing it? I would say thank you to the Zorab Center for gathering us here today to begin these conversations. And I think that these conversations are the beginnings that allow us to address things like racism in their myriad avenues, the myriad manifestations, together with one voice. And I would say that we should have a Christian voice, like our brother said earlier, not a secular voice, but a Christian voice in addressing these, which means, what do our scriptures say? What do our liturgical rites say? What do we say together? What can we learn from each other? What do we have to contribute to this conversation? But I would like us not to just be a random cacophony, but if we can, like one voice on these types of matters. That's all I have to say in sort of introduction, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was really, I mean, you've already pushed us in a lot of important directions. So now I'm like already resetting, which I shouldn't do. I should just say what I'm going to say, and then we can have our conversation. But you've already given us so much. So as I mentioned, I'm Chris Sheklian. I'm the director of the Zorab Center. I'm also an ordained deacon of the Armenian Church. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Armenian Church and think a little bit about the question of race in America for Armenians, something that I'm not an expert on, and there are plenty of people who have done better than me, and I will point to some of those things, but to try to kind of pull it together, specifically thinking through the church a little bit. So just by way of brief introduction for those who might not be totally familiar, the Armenian Church often is just it's the Church of Armenia, the Armenian Church in Armenian, the highest Anyai. Oftentimes it is called the Armenian Apostolic Church, and that's crucial because there is a claim to apostolic succession, and in fact, Armenians claim two different apostles, both Thaddeus and Bartholomew, that they suggest, and that the various early histories detail how both of them came to preach the gospel in Armenia. So there's a real early preaching of the gospel in the land of Armenia. And one of the interesting things is there's a kind of historically, Deacon Henok was talking about the different kind of sees. And for Armenians, the two major influences came out of basically Cappadocia, so a Greek-speaking, coming largely from the major center of Caesarea, and also a huge influence coming out of basically Antioch and Edessa, what becomes the Syriac Church. So these are two really early influences on the Armenian Church before a kind of full national church was established. And that happens, the traditional date being 301 AD, very famously. The conversion story is really wonderful. If you ever have the chance to read it and get all the details, it's really a wonderful story that includes like werebores and like 13 years in a deep pit that you can still climb down. If you go to Armenia and you climb down the deep pit, it's like the scariest part of anybody's trip to Armenia. It's like going down the pit where St. Gregory spent 13 years. And so this St. Gregory is the traditional illuminator, converter of Armenians. The traditional date is 301 AD. It's somewhere in there. And for a long time, the bishops of Armenia were consecrated in Caesarea by the metropolitan there. After a few generations, it became basically they stopped going there to be consecrated. And at that point, we can say that there was an autocephalous Armenian church from that point going forward. Theologically, eventually, the Council of Chalcedon was not accepted. So the first three ecumenical councils, as is shared between all of these churches we're talking about, were accepted. Chalcedon was not. As with most of these churches, I think it's really important to keep in mind that this was not like an immediate sort of rejection. I think this is one of the things that often when we talk about these histories, it's like, oh, and then, they said no. And, sure, there were some monks, there were some hierarchs, there were some folks, but the sort of solidification of that actually took quite a bit of time. And in the Armenian case, it's not until a couple hundred years later that there's an explicit statement that sort of rejects and, basically anathematizes the Council of Chalcedon. So I think that's important to kind of keep in mind when we think ecumenically. And of course, here we're talking about folks who are all sort of on the same page with regard to that council. But I think, we're here having an ecumenical conversation and thinking about sort of pan-Orthodox solidarity. And so I think that's an important sort of point to keep in mind. The Armenian Church was tied to the Armenian state for a very long time. It was a crucial part of the Armenian state. Armenians are very proud to say that they are the first Christian nation because it became a state official religion. The vicissitudes of Armenian history meant that there has been an Armenian church as an institution with much more continuity than there have been varying different Armenian kingdoms and principalities throughout time. Of course, eventually, the vast majority of Armenians end up split between basically three empires, with the vast majority in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman, the Persian, and the Russian empires. By sort of the moment of immigration to America, this is the sort of the situation, with the majority really being in the Ottoman Empire. And this is something that I think we want to be talking about, is actually these sort of shared histories. So especially when we're talking about the Syriac Church and the Armenian Church, there's a lot of shared history within that Ottoman context. This is true of other churches as well, but I think just given the sort of presence on the sort of that core Anatolian part of Ottoman territory, that experience is rather particularly shared. It led to difficulties as well. I don't need to get into those details, but it gives a kind of shared history. So if we're talking then about Armenians coming to America, everybody likes to quote Martin the Armenian, the famous first Armenian who was at Jamestown. What he was doing there exactly, whether he was a servant or a silk expert or whatever, who knows, but this is everybody's favorite Armenian character, known as Martin the Armenian. But basically from then, our first sort of real known immigration begins really in the early 19th century. There's a great character, Christopher Oskanian, who a friend of mine, Nora Lesserson, is working on a great dissertation and basically charting his exploits in New York and his sort of positionality between Ottoman and Armenian, actually, which is, I think, important for our conversation, thinking about, race and identity and sort of positionality of people. So after Oskanian, we can say then that it's not really until the late 19th century that we see a strong influx of Armenian immigration. And this is true of a lot of the Ottoman territories and Ottoman subjects. So, Armenians were not necessarily special, and this other Ottoman subjects were coming as well. But Armenians had perhaps a kind of pipeline through American missionaries. So the first Armenians who were coming to America were often converts to American Protestant missionaries, a major region being the city of Harpert. So the area of Harpert in what is today Eastern Turkey was a major center of missionary activity and one of the first places that a lot of folks went. And actually the first Armenian apostolic Christians also tended to come from that region. So starting in the late 19th century, you get that immigration, and a huge number of Harpert Armenians ended up in Worcester, Massachusetts. There was a shoe factory there, and that was kind of one of the main draws. And in Worcester, this was the first sort of parish that was established around 1889 with a full church consecrated in 1891. So this is important, I think, for our conversation going forward also because Armenians have been in America in larger numbers earlier than most of our other Oriental Orthodox brothers and sisters. Again, the Syriac Church and Syriac Christians did partake in that sort of Ottoman movement as well. There were Syriac Christians there, but the numbers were just not as high. And so, going forward in our conversation, I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. Our experience of being in America is very, very different because, the first church, the first parish is consecrated in 1891. And by 1898, there is an American diocese that is headquartered out of First Worcester, Massachusetts, before it eventually makes its way to New York later. So major centers of early Armenian immigration is this Massachusetts area, and then also California, which is where I'm from. Central California was a major early center. So the first Armenian churches, the first one is in Worcester, the second one is in Fresno, and then there's actually a number of churches in the Central Valley of California, to the extent that a separate California diocese, what's now known as the Western Diocese, but originally it was just the California Diocese, was established already in, I wrote this down. I want to get it right. Where'd I go? I believe it's 1928. There it is in my notes. Make sure I get my dates right. So we have had these two dioceses for quite some time. And the numbers grew in the late 19th century. But of course, what really brings lots of Armenians into America ultimately is the Armenian genocide of 1915. This changes the sort of demographics from some churches with isolated centers to huge numbers of Armenians. And for our purposes, the other important thing that this does is of course, this is a completely reasonably traumatic and sort of breaking moment in Armenian history, right? I mean, there are almost no Armenians left in the western part of the historic homeland of Armenia. And what this meant then is that Armenians here are sort of always working through that. And it was, in fact, genocide. The word genocide, right, has the same root as genes, genetics. So, modern historians have been pretty clear that the target was, in fact, a racial target, right? This is a target of race. So what that means for our purposes tonight is that the genocide continues to be not only just a touchstone for Armenians and Armenian Christians and Armenian history, but I would say formative for the way that Armenians continue to think about race because of that targeting by a race. Now, this gets complicated because, for instance, the Armenian Church in 2015, the 100th anniversary of the genocide, canonized all of those who were killed during the genocide as martyrs. So this complicates things, right? Were they killed because of their religion or because of their race? Now, Candace and I could go down, we come from a similar theoretical lineage, and we could go down a long rabbit hole talking about religion and ethnicity and how you separate them, and if you can, and blah, 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 blah. You can read my dissertation if you really care that much about that. But the point being is that however you want to think about that, the event also is definitive for the way that Armenians continue to think about race. And this is understandable, but also deeply problematic, because I guess I'm going to now go on record here, right, saying clearly that a racialized logic continues to be operative among Armenians, I would say partly as a response to the genocide. Now, my suggestion has always been that one could have sort of rejected the logic of race after that, but instead Armenians largely doubled down on a conception of race. And it truly is race. It is bloodline race. We spend a lot of effort distinguishing, are you, Gesai, are you half Armenian? Are you this? How much Armenian are you? Which is clearly a logic of blood, genetics, and race. So I want to just sort of, say that for our purposes, whatever else the genocide was, it also for thinking about race sets the parameters to this day for what Armenians are thinking about with race. And in fact, we've had all these wonderful conversations as Armenians about race in the United States, and a lot of the responses come back to the genocide, which, I'm going to say misses the point about having a conversation about race in America in 2020. So it becomes a bit of a stumbling block for Armenians to think about race as well. And what happened in America is that Armenians were discriminated against as well. Again, in California, a derogatory term of Fresno Indian was often applied. You can read in Soroyan's writings, the famous Fresno Armenian writer, about some of this. There was a kind of version of redlining, actually, in Fresno. There are still houses that have on the deeds that they should not be sold to Armenians. There's a few Armenians that I know who take pride in owning those houses that technically the deed says they're not supposed to be owning. So there was a kind of early, ethno-racial discrimination against Armenians in America. What that resulted in, and I am not the expert here, and I might even put in the link here, there's a wonderful article from quite some time ago now that was on, it's called the Ajam Media Collective, written by Aram Gugasian, who wrote a really important piece looking at the couple legal cases that led to Armenians basically accessing legal whiteness within the United States. Right, and I'm not going to go into all the context of this, but the context, of course, includes the Asian Exclusion Act. It includes all of these sort of things that restricted immigration right around the time that Armenians were coming during the genocide and really needed to be able to get into America. So as Gugasian says very clearly, Armenians legally moved themselves from the category at the time of Asiatic to white. So since I wrote that down too, I believe 1928 as well, maybe 1925 was the court case, I believe. Cartosian court case, Armenians have had what we could say access to legal whiteness. Now, does that always mean, phenomenological whiteness, we could say? Of course not. But the ability to access legal whiteness basically throughout the entirety of the 20th century, I think, is crucial for thinking about the place of Armenians and race today. Because, there have been waves of Armenian migration. Armenians from the Middle East came during the civil war in Beirut. They came during the Iranian Revolution, after the Iranian Revolution. They came after the fall of the Soviet Union. And we could say that perhaps some of these more recent immigrants have had less access to, say, the daily benefits of whiteness, but nonetheless have been able to access that legal whiteness. So I think that this is an important sort of a point to keep in mind. One of the other things that I just want to sort of briefly mention is that this also means that Armenians were in America and legally white for the civil rights movement, and we did a decent job. There's a really wonderful picture of at the time Bishop, I don't think it was yet Archbishop Torkum Manugian, as well as some other priests of the diocese who were at it was the 1968 Poor People's March that Martin Luther King Jr. had organized, but then happened after his death. And it's a really wonderful picture. It's kind of the Armenians' response to those iconic images of the Greek Bishop Yakovos at marches with MLK, which is to say that clearly there has been a recognition that these problems are also things that Armenians should take up. And that, this image in particular, I think, is really wonderful because it suggests a possibility for it also being a Christian response, right? The Poor People's March, right? A bunch of priests, Armenian priests, in their distinctive garb with their distinctive headgear at a march organized by Martin Luther King Jr. to think about poverty, poverty connected to racism, right? So that suggests the possibility of a kind of Christian response and suggests that there was at least a nascent possibility of that. Now, this tendency, I would say, has collided with the other tendency of a kind of racialized thinking among Armenians, to the point that we now have plenty of what we could, maybe call mixed race Armenians, Black, again, we like to be we love the half and half, Armenians like to do this, what percentage? I'm a quarter Armenian and a quarter this and a quarter that. And we have in our churches, Black Armenians who have spoken out recently in the wake of George Floyd's killings about their experiences within the Armenian Church. And it's not all pretty. It's not all pretty. So I would say that we could maybe, and maybe I will end here. There's a way in which there was a kind of collision between a recognition that there could be a Christian response to race and racism and poverty, and the kind of nexus of all of those problems in America, and a kind of lingering racialized logic that organizes a lot of the Armenian community, including the Armenian Church. And I kind of think that that's where we're at today still, is struggling with those sort of conflicting logics. And I might go ahead and leave it there, because the other things that I would talk about push us into a lot more of the ecumenical stuff, and maybe it's worth saving that just for our conversation. And I'll give Candace the floor then.
Thanks, Chris. As was indicated earlier, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do want to just touch briefly on a kind of a thread that both Chris and Henok have helped me to think a little bit about this. I guess I want to start with kind of the more traditional kind of discourse of the kind of Coptic church's narrative, and why this is important for actually us understanding the political conditions of American Copts as well. So I'm going to do kind of a hagiographic narrative a bit here, and not go into too many of the details, because I think that would get us off track, but just so we're on the same kind of footing here. So in terms of the Coptic Church, the Coptic Church will say, and Copts themselves, obviously, myself being a white convert to the church as well, just to put that out there. So the church is established by Saint Mark in the 1st century, and this is obviously a very important marker that one of the apostles starts the Coptic Church, or is the founder of it. And thinking about the importance of the Alexandrian See, and this was mentioned by both Henok and Chris as being kind of central for us, thinking also about a pre-Chalcedonian understanding of our communities. But the importance of those early church fathers of the Alexandrian See, St. Athanasius, St. Cyril, Origen, if I can be so controversial, as being kind of Coptic, identified, right? And the particular pride that those saints and those early church fathers have within the Coptic Church. And then beyond that, just thinking about Egypt as the home of monasticism and the Desert Fathers. So thinking about St. Anthony. So Egypt becomes a kind of a site of the early church and how it's remembered even today beyond the Coptic Church, thinking about those that study early Christianity, etc. And so one of the key things, a part of the Coptic Church and its collective memory beyond this kind of early church narrative, is the era of the martyrs, or the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian, which begins in 284 AD. And this is when the Coptic calendar actually begins. And so you understand kind of how important thinking about that era and thinking about persecution is to the collective memory of the Coptic Church and Copts more broadly. And so, obviously Chalcedon being very central to the Coptic Church's narrative. So it's not simply kind of how our churches come together in Chalcedon, but the kind of central, the centrality of the Coptic Church to that, that council, right? And thinking about Pope Dioscoros of Alexandria and his exile, and the kind of the centrality of Coptic characters to that particular council is what is remembered in kind of Coptic collective memory. And so, we kind of shift from the era of the martyrs through Chalcedon, and the kind of subjugation and different forms of oppression that happened thereafter under the Byzantine Empire, whether that is the remembrance of different saints that were persecuted under the Byzantine Empire, like, for example, Saint Samuel the Confessor, beaten by the Byzantine imperial envoy, and many others. So we have the Byzantine Empire and persecution, and then obviously 641 AD, the Arab conquest of Egypt becomes also a central form of Coptic collective memory, and subsequent Islamic empires thereafter in different eras of persecution, one of the major ones being under the Fatimids. And historian Marianne Shenouda has written an entire dissertation about this period and thinking about collective memory and persecution and martyrdom under the Fatimids. And so, in thinking about kind of post-Arab conquest Egypt, what has come about more recently is thinking about a Copto-Arabic tradition and the movement of translation into thinking about, a Coptic tradition that is understood through Arabic translation and the different shifts that happen culturally and liturgically thereafter. And then I would say that the kind of next historical context that leads us into a conversation about immigration to the United States and is very important for probably all of our churches in the Oriental Orthodox family is the late 18th century and the arrival of the French and then the British to Egypt, and kind of colonial regimes that really reorder and remap the Coptic tradition onto new, quote unquote, modern logics. And as was mentioned by Chris, just, also the American and British missionary influence over the tradition, over, thinking about religious education, et cetera. These are very important aspects for thinking about the modern shifts in the Coptic Church and thinking about religious tradition. So that's kind of the overview that I wanted to give for those that are a very modest overview and very humble overview for those that are not as closely connected to the Coptic Church or from one of the sister churches. But one of the things I want to start with in thinking about immigration to the US is 1952 independence from the British and the creation of a post-colonial nation state under Gamal Abdel Nasser in the late 50s, early 60s. And it is here that, and this is the moment very similar to the narrative that Deacon Henok identified earlier, and we have in the 50s and the 60s professionals coming to the United States, educators who are meant to go back to Egypt, right, and to educate Egyptians. But what ends up happening is that many of them stay. And so you have this first wave of immigration, which Dr. Michael Ekledios of the Coptic Canadian History Project, what will be Egypt Migrations, focuses on. And it is that first wave filled, of professionals that creates, some of the first churches in the United States in Jersey City, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, mainly from middle to upper class folks in Cairo and Alexandria. One thing I do want to mention, and is very important to our conversation, is that in the late 50s, you have the start of Coptic missions to Southern Africa, so to Kenya and elsewhere. As well as eventually to what now Bolivia, one of the largest missions of the Coptic Church. The majority of folks in that church are Bolivians themselves, but we also have the Coptic Church in Japan and elsewhere. And strangely enough, and I mentioned this to Deacon Henok earlier, in thinking about Coptic understandings of race and maybe modernity as well, there was one man I interacted with during my fieldwork in the New York, New Jersey area who said that he went on a mission trip to Ethiopia, which is quite odd to me, considering that, obviously we are sister churches. And he had mentioned that he went on this mission trip to help Ethiopians with, kind of the superstitious nature of their tradition to make them more modern, right? And so when we think about that, we have to think about the kind of colonial context as well, right? The colonial remnants of that framing too. And so, just kind of going through the timeline to get to the more important things that I want to focus on is 1970s, 80s, there's different waves of immigrants, but particularly from the 1990s onwards, we have a completely different class of Copts that come to the United States under the green card lottery. Egypt is one of the highest recipients of the green card lottery with, this was a couple of years ago, I need to get updated statistics, but they had almost about 5,000, which is the cap, coming from Egypt. And my own fieldwork was amongst Copts in Egypt that were applying to the green card lottery. And so I would also argue that the majority of Egyptians that do win the green card lottery are Copts because the church facilitates that immigration. And so that's a completely different class of Copts, mainly from rural parts of Egypt, from Upper Egypt. And so what ends up happening, as Deacon Henok also identified with the Ethiopian church, is that this creates, certain clashes of what should the church's focus be on, right? Should we focus on those a part of the earlier generations that are more assimilated, quote unquote, into particular forms of whiteness, I would argue, or these new immigrants, right, that don't speak English, that are from different classes, etc. And this gets exacerbated after 2011, after the Egyptian revolution, when we have more and more asylum seekers and folks coming from on the green card lottery coming to the United States. And this has created a lot of tensions in local parishes, but I'll leave it at that for that timeline. The main things that I want to address vis-a-vis race, and I know I've gone over the 10 minutes that I said I was going to talk for, but in order for us to continue this conversation, I need to identify just, maybe 3 things that are very important for us to think about in thinking about Copts and race in America. And that being, first and foremost, how the ways that the Christianity of Copts places many, and I'm not saying all, I'm saying many, within the community into political alignment with the conservative values of evangelicals and others. And I'm sure for other members of other Oriental Orthodox churches, this is also very similar. And so one of the things I found really interesting is that I published an article with Public Orthodoxy yesterday, and somebody left a very, in my opinion, very important Twitter response saying that this kind of convergence of Copts and more conservative Christian forces in the United States is, quote, heavily due to Copts being very religious Christians. So pro-life, platforms would be more appealing to the average Copt than the alternative, end quote. And so when we think about that, it produces a particular racial predicament in that Copts are placed into kind of Christian kinship with white conservative America. Yet at the same time, many of them cannot escape the optics of non-white suspicion, particularly in thinking about kind of post 9/11 kind of war on terror logics of the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim kind of terrorist stereotype. And so what ends up happening, it becomes a 2-pronged issue. Like, one, conservative values within the Coptic communities may not be able to save American Copts from American racism, right? Like, so in saying that, okay, I'm not one of those bad guys, right? Like, I am, an upstanding American citizen, and I've been very successful in this or that. But it also, very importantly, and I'm going to just kind of say this and leave it for discussion, is that those values also intersect with particular discourses, conservative values that is, around race and racism in America. So how one views anti-Blackness, protest, slavery, and reparations, these particular debates that are happening in kind of white conservative circles also impact upon Coptic conversations as well. And so for the sake of time, I just want to say in terms of thinking about kind of Coptic intersections, like with these kind of racial dynamics in the United States, there's 3 things that we want to maybe think about. One, the kind of social aspect of things, how folks really try to separate themselves from the optics of suspicion, right? So whether changing names, I've met folks who have changed their name from, this is an example, but maybe from Osama to Sam, right? Or many other examples like that to avoid suspicion. I had a friend, an asylum seeker, recently tell me that, and this is what he said, quote, in Algeria and Egypt, where he lived and worked, yes, they would question my name there, as a Christian, and I may be discriminated against because I'm Christian. But here in the United States, what matters is your accent, your lahga, or your color, lon. And that was one of the things that he, said was quite different for him, especially coming to the United States from a middle-class family in Egypt, that he had that particular class protection vis-a-vis his identity as a Christian. So I think I've gone over my time. There's so many more things to, I think, focus on, whether it's, American Coptic churches and the Americanization of the Coptic Church, white converts to the church and their influence in the politics of the community, or just thinking about racism in Coptic churches, whether that be from African-American inquirers to the faith, Ethiopians and Eritreans attending liturgy and experiencing racism in some churches, and also kind of desires for whiteness, focusing on lighter skin tones, hair texture, etc. So sorry, that's a little bit of a smattering, but I already went over. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Candace. I think you're still running on my over the time clock, so you shouldn't worry too much about that. That was awesome. And I really appreciate what you've pointed us to here, thinking about, how the alignment of certain kind of Christian values might then put all of us into certain conundrums when it comes to, it's not just certain Christian values, it becomes a whole sort of set of things that then you are aligned with, some of which might come to sort of, bite you as well. So I think that's a really important point. And I think it's something we can take up. So very quickly, I've clearly spent more than my fair share of my time talking, but what I want to say as we shift here are a couple things. First, I just want to be very clear that this is a preliminary conversation. I think we're gonna keep having this conversation. The point is to get us together and to start thinking these things together. And so, with that in mind, what we've given here are sort of individual pictures with a few sort of nods to things that have bound us together historically. And where I want to move us then, as we start talking as a kind of conversation here, the first thing I want to think about is, okay, given those individual historical experiences, what could the grounds of coming together here in America be, especially around the question of race? Because, on the one hand, we have things that we do share, whether that be the imperial context of the Ottoman Empire or forms of discrimination when first upon arrival to America. On the other hand, we have phenotypically vastly different possibilities. We have 100 years of difference in terms of our time collectively here in America. And we have different possibilities in terms of legal access, whether that be Armenians being declared legally white, or the question of immigration, that is bound up to the situation in Egypt and the sort of the global American response to Islamic terrorism, right? So there are these sort of like vastly different experiences as well as these shared experiences. So if we're going to think together, if we're really going to say, okay, what could an Oriental Orthodox Christian response to this question of race be? It seems it's got to be grounded in each of our individual churches' experiences, but what are those that are shared, right? And or do we overcome the differences in other ways? So my question is sort of, given those historical experiences, what do we do? And before I open it up, I just want to briefly mention that there have been, largely in America, although not only, varying sort of moments of Oriental Orthodox efforts together, right? So most famously, of course, worldwide, which was alluded to, is 1964-65, in Ethiopia, kind of almost a synod, really, that was convened. And I think that's a really important moment. And then here in America, what is one of my favorite acronyms, SCOOCH, the Standing Conference of Oriental Orthodox Churches, was formed in 1973. And it was largely grounded in the New York, New Jersey area, but is represented by these different dioceses. So there have been these moments, and I think Candace and Henok, you both pointed to points when, for instance, in Los Angeles when there was a Coptic church but not an Ethiopian church, sort of by default, some of these moments of coming together. But outside of those, how do we come together given our both similar and at times wildly divergent experiences? What's the grounds for a solidarity?
I'll jump in, and then I guess I'll let y'all jump in. As I said, my crazy wild idea is I would love for us to, meld together into one church, like it's the Armenian Apostolic or the Coptic Church or the Ethiopian Tawahid or whatever the name is, like the North American Miaphysite Church or something like that. That might be a pipe dream for now. So on the road, the kind of three pillars of our church, there are many things we can point to, but some of the things, we're known to do best from the beginning is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. So the standing committee and the synod in Addis Ababa, by the way, for those who don't recognize, when he's calling it a synod, right, the synod's like the council of bishops. What's funny about that is, like, we talk about Chalcedon in 451, which I'm not even sure there's any historical evidence of any Ethiopians being there. That might have just been the Copts speaking on our behalf. But when we talk about that, like, really the last time we got to get the band together was 451. And then you fast forward to 1960, we're really just like, we say we're one, but we've kind of been doing our own thing in separate areas throughout this time. And it's just an incredible fact that, but for the grace of God, we just have to realize we've grown to have some unique features amongst us in our expression. I'll give you some silly examples before I get to the meat of it. In the Ethiopian church, it's seen as rude when you receive the blood of Christ not to cover your mouth. In the Coptic church, it's seen as rude to cover your mouth. In the Ethiopian church, it's seen as rude to have shoes in the sanctuary, especially not the inner sanctuary where the priest is. In the Syriac church, they have special shoes that they wear when they enter the sanctuary. And all of us have our own sort of special, unique reasons for why all of that is. And as Chris mentioned, there are a bunch of historical funny accidents. In my own personal life, my father and all of his siblings all had Armenian godparents, because Ethiopia is one of the places where a lot of Armenians went after the genocide. And in fact, there's the famous Armenian band that was with the emperor as well, that a lot of people like to point out to as a historical note. But anyway, we're here now in this situation. And so I think fasting may be a little bit more difficult, but we have our own church calendar to do the fasting. But I think the West Coast does not really have quite the equivalent of the standing committee in terms of prayer. We've had this thing in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, St. Peter's and Paul's Coptic Church, every year, usually about the week after Pascha or Easter, hosts something that they call a Pan-Orthodox Praise Day, so that in the morning, all of us take communion together. And we even invite, the Greeks and the Russians and that communion for the afternoon, where everyone sort of presents hymns in their honor. So I think the kind of basic thing is we just need to start meeting together and praying together, seeing each other's faces like we're doing now and praying. But the kind of third and I think more tangible thing, especially when we talk about racial inequity, there's a huge conversation nowadays about the difference between equality and equity. That is the equality or opportunity under the law, but then the kind of mismatched outcomes that result given the sort of historical oppression that has happened and the ongoing or current systemic stumbling blocks that exist. So I think one of the big things that we can do, and it's a call from the gospel, is we can look, where are there widows? Where are there, orphans? Where are those who are needing housing? Where are those immigrants, be they, Syrian Muslims or Catholic Hispanics from Latin America? Where are those kind of gaps of racial inequity? And how can we get together with the idea of charity, with the idea of almsgiving, and not just that we are imbuing these people with whatever we have, but that we're standing in solidarity, eating with them, and inviting them to whatever table that we has as one Afro-Asiatic or Oriental voice. This is what we stand for. you know, it may not be, you know, petitioning our Congress people, but it might be having a very vocal presence in our local communities. And I think especially because of the nature of how those synods work, or the Council of Bishops work, if we're more and more organized about these, and we're in all of these major cities in the West Coast, the Midwest, the South, and the East Coast, I think that would have a powerful effect. So I think that's kind of one idea. Like, I'm always impressed by, you know, a shout out to your old brothers and sisters, Candace, the Catholics, you know, the Catholic charities of the United States are, if I'm not mistaken, you know, the largest charity in the United States. And so having a kind of Afro-Asiatic or Oriental equivalent would make me very proud. And I would love to participate in Southern California. I didn't mention it earlier, but I'm pretty much based out of the Cathedral of the Southern California Diocese. And so if anyone on this call, or who reaches this, is in our church, in our communion, and involved anywhere in Los Angeles or San Diego, you know, I'd love to do this sort of work on a local basis.
Can I say something a little controversial? I think Deacon Henok gives us very real steps forward for us. But I do want to emphasize, and I think this becomes a major problem for many of our churches, is that one of the things that we can think about bringing us together, particularly in the modern period, but like we can also think about kind of the collective memory of Chalcedon, is thinking about, like, you know, imperial subjugation, and I think that there's a really tangible way we need to also address the fact that the reasons that we didn't come together were also very much imperial in nature, right? Imperial divisions. We didn't have an emperor like that brought us together. And so I think until 1964 with Emperor Selassie. So I think that that's really important for us to address first and foremost. But, you know, skipping over to 1964, 1965 and the conference and the context it comes in thinking about decolonization, thinking about the ways that synod, that conference, was convened in the context of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism and many other isms like coming about at that time that was trying to traverse the nation, while also the consolidation of national forms, right? Whether that be the Ethiopian nation, the Egyptian nation, whatever else. And so there's this kind of dialectic back and forth between empire and nation that has also separated us. And one of the things I do want to bring to the fore, and this brings us to the racial context in the United States, is the way that American empire has also separated us, particularly in the interest in the persecution of many of our Christian communities throughout Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, and the ways that that particular persecution is taken up by American Christian conservative factions. One of the things I wanted to ethnographically point to that I thought was very interesting is that in the aftermath of the Botroseya bombings in 2016 in Cairo, in December, when a bomb went off at the cathedral complex, killing many, there was a 40-day commemoration in New Jersey. And obviously politicians came, politicians offered their condolences, talked about how the Copts that there's a friendship between Copts and American Christian politicians, et cetera. One of the things that I was struck by was it wasn't just American Christian politicians there, white Christian politicians. It was also members of the Malankara Church, members of the Syriac Church, I believe, as well, and a couple of others. And one thing that that Zachariah Mar Nikoloios, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, the Northeast Diocese of the Malankara Church, noted during his speech, he said, "I stand in solidarity with the Coptic Church, even though the faithful of the Coptic Church who were martyred were in Cairo. When a part of the church hurts, it hurts the whole church. So I just want to say that it hurts even the Malankaran Church when the Coptic faithful are attacked and martyred." And so let's take that seriously also as a form of solidarity and thinking about the connections between Cairo and Kerala, and how us coming together in the United States and addressing anti-Black racism here can also be a product of us coming together as a church community without the mediation of American religio-political powers.
I think that's really important, and I think there's a sort of sense of, and Daryapram sort of was pushing me towards this, but a way in which these shared, we could call them shared sufferings, right? That are either directly shared in the case of, say, the Armenian genocide and what what Syriacs call the SIFO, the sword, or the ability to recognize these sort of shared sufferings first amongst each other, as you're sort of suggesting, Candace, but then that maybe is one of the grounds for positing what that then shared Oriental Orthodox response to racism in America might be, right? So that seems to be one important possibility that we're pointing to, right? A kind of something built on the fact that whether or not we now have access to whiteness, we were all sort of non-white immigrants at some point. Whether or not we are in pretty decent socioeconomic places here now or not, there is a recognition of sort of the suffering shared across our churches that then, ought to, we could suggest that it should be pretty obvious then to be in some kind of solidarity with the marginalized. And again, that's that image of those Armenian priests at the march, right? Like that we also stand against poverty, right? That should be a pretty obvious response, which then that begs the question, right, of what is the stumbling block? And I think, Candace, I think you've done a really good job pointing to some of the imperial divisions, but also I think crucially that uptake of a certain set of political values that is aligned with a certain version of Christianity in America that then might be one of the stumbling block as well. Because to me, it just seems like, like here are all these different churches and peoples who have had sort of suffering that ought to bring them both together and in alignment with, the wretched of the earth, right? To throw Fanon in there just for fun.
And can I just also just briefly say that, it is quite disheartening to remember that in June, that there were Ethiopian Orthodox priests that went out to the Black Lives Matter protests and were photographed, and obviously was shared all over social media because they looked great. Let's just admit that, the most stylish out there. But that being said, when we have our sister churches that are not outside of what is actually happening within American society in terms of anti-Black racism. So like when we are not, addressing that kind of that pain that maybe members of our, broader umbrella of churches are feeling indirectly or directly, that's a problem, right? Like if members of the Coptic Church or other churches are adhering to conservative racial logics that actually affect those within our body of faithful, that is very problematic and quite hurtful, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I have another brother named Chris who's on the line right now. He has this line. He says a lot. That's my quarterback. So that was his beatitude, Bishop Barnabas, who is he's the Bishop of Southern California and Alaska. We have Alaska in our diocese too. Don't ask me why. And alongside a few other priests from our parish, which is Virgin Mary's. And we had one priest, Father Thomas, who was from a different parish, but it was predominantly the priests of the Virgin Mary's parish, which is my parish. And what they did is they gave a message in solidarity with the life lost, with the acknowledgement of the police brutality. And then actually one of the monks did, and this might be controversial to some people, but he did basically the funerary rite for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. He sang a psalm. I might butcher the English because I'm translating off of the top of my head, but it's "Go, O my soul, go into your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you," or plentifully with you. And so we chant this, in the melodies of our tradition. And so they chanted that psalm along with a little message in English. And so that relates to kind of one of the pegs that I mentioned earlier of having a kind of a certain voice in terms of prayer. It would have been nice, if it was more like all of us together. But yeah, it was nice that it was the actual bishop of the diocese going to downtown Los Angeles to do that. And like you said, it was shared many times on social media.
That's awesome. That's really wonderful. Candace, I think, the other thing that I think you're sort of suggesting that might be one of our stumbling blocks, that I don't want to take us too far down this rabbit hole, because this is a conversation that I know happens within each of our churches all the time, is that sort of identity as a kind of immigrant church. And the Armenian Church still is a kind of immigrant church several generations later, in part because we constantly are having waves of migration. That leads to a kind of, well, we got to focus on our stuff. And right now, Armenians, to be totally fair, Armenians are in a kind of existential battle at this moment, and that's where attention deserves to be. But generally speaking, right, I think we all see this in our church communities, that there's a sense, okay, the extent that we do outreach is to, the various people within our own church communities. It's slow but sure that Armenian youth groups go do work in their broader community. So, I think one of the stumbling blocks, and I think what's wonderful, is that just being here and doing these kinds of things together is already sort of pushing, like, even just to do Oriental Orthodox conversations pushes us beyond our individual church conversations and helps us to overcome that stumbling block of sort of only focusing on our quote unquote people, because I do believe that that's one of the issues. And it's something that came up, constantly with Armenian Christians in their response to the Black Lives Matter protests and movements over the course of the summer. Well, sure, but what about genocide recognition? Sure, but our people have this problem. Sure, but we've got a lot of poverty among Armenians in Southern California. Sure, but, right? And I think that there's a way in which even just forcing ourselves to be together as Oriental Orthodox Christians already pushes us beyond that a little bit, that maybe might push us therefore into engagement with American society at large, which forces us to confront questions of race and racism.
I think there's a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, I know that the one wants to jump in there and say what they said. Yes, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, so my name's Chris Selassie, and those are our parish priests who participated in that rally in downtown Los Angeles and another one nearby. And I think that something important to note, when the start of the conversation was kind of a matter of politics and people's different political opinions about how to approach a policy-oriented mindset about racism in our society, in our community. And one of the things that our father, the priest, Kesis Malaku, shared on behalf of our Bishop Aruna Barnabas was the mindset of what he was really coming to the rally to speak. And he acknowledged that it could be perceived as controversial for a priest. Davion, it's not your turn. Sorry, it's my 1-year-old son. So I think that our father acknowledged there's some controversy and even the visual optics of a priest in his, cassock at the rally. But he said out of his heart that some people may be wondering why a priest, a minister of God, is speaking about politics. But he said that when it comes to Black Lives Matter and issues of racism in our community, and particularly the violence that many people experience in our community because of race, specifically because of race, that it's not a political matter, that it is a Christian matter, that it is a theological matter, to affirm that Black life matters. When he said our Lord and Savior gave his life on the cross for everybody, and that as Christians, we need to be acknowledging that mutual love for other people and suffering with those who suffer, like Apostle Paul mentioned, be chained as those who are in chains. And so while maybe the solutions to issues of racism and violence and police brutality in our communities have politics attached to it, simply raising awareness of the problem, which is what our fathers, the priests, wanted to do, is not a matter of politics. And I think when sometimes people get a political aversion to seeing rallies against racism and police brutality, it kind of, people need to open their heart in a Christian way to put aside their politics, because their politics form a kind of blinder. And I think our fathers, the priests, wanted to be visible so that people could start to have that kind of culture shock moment and go into their heart and hear what they had to say, more than just the politics of anti-racism, but to acknowledge a Christian message behind it, which is truly brotherly love, and particularly the sanctity of life. You know, in politics, there's a pro-life movement in regards to that. And I think sometimes the rebuttal to that is the totality of life is not always acknowledged in people's politics. And so our fathers, the priests, wanted to share that perspective of, we're not necessarily here to debate the political solutions to the violence that people are experiencing, but to advocate and raise awareness that as Christians, we need to become more conscientious about hearing those voices of people who are experiencing that. And we can then have a political discussion of what those solutions might look like. But we need to acknowledge in our hearts as Christians that the violence people experience, and we're talking about violence that people have experienced in other communities in other parts of the world as Christians as well, it's the same experience. And so as Christians, we need to go into our heart and really, you know, separate the politics, separate the solution, and just acknowledge the problem, whether it's happening to Egyptians and Coptic Christians, whether it's going on for Armenian Christians, whether it's happening in Ethiopia right now for Ethiopian Christians, or whether happening to Black and brown people here in the United States. It's something that as Christians, we really have to confront as to why our political blinders might stop us from really acknowledging the problem. You know, the solution is a debate, but I think sometimes people's politics blind them from even acknowledging the problem, whether we're talking about around the world or here. And our priests just wanted to send that powerful visual message of, we're here not politically, but as priests, as religious people, to kind of prick the conscience of other Christians. And I think it's very similar to the way we saw the Greek Metropolitan marching with Dr. King in the 60s. And his counterpart today was also marching in a Black Lives Matter rally in DC. Again, saying that message about, let's acknowledge the humanity and the indignity as Christians that people experience. And then we can, once we've all acknowledged the problem, we can flesh out our differences of politics for the solution. Thank you for letting me share, by the way. It was just touched really hard because those are, as I said on my quarterback, those are our priests and friends of mine. So I just want to share their message to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the conversation.
That's huge. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. And I just very quickly, so I'm going to stay on here. So that one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that Candace and I are both part of this wonderful group that has taken the name the Oriental Orthodox Solidarity Project, that was really born out of basically responses to racism and trying to form a kind of anti-racist Oriental Orthodox group. And our group is having a kind of a book night tonight that is about to start. I'm going to stick around for a little bit. Candace, I know you should make your own decision, but I really, I don't want us to go for too long, because I want to continue this work in other ways as well. But before I move us to a close, so that all of us don't have to make that decision, those of us who are going to do both things, Chris, I really appreciate your one of your comments is that you know, at the very least, the problem is a theological one, right? Whatever the solution might be, the problem is not political, it's theological. And that was the other main question that I had for us to speak about. And I want to make sure that we get to that before we begin to diverge here, which is basically, you know, okay, so we have a possibility of grounding our solidarity here in these kind of shared experiences, these shared histories, these, you know, shared imperial responses, immigration, all of these things. But, you know, at least at some level, the thing that holds us together is a kind of, you know, theological, ecclesial idea, which means that in theory, there should also be an ability to give a shared theological response to the problem of racism. And that's where I want to kind of take us and also leave us, because I think it's a really important thing to tackle. You know, as our group has been kind of working, one of the things that I learned and encountered was that the Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox Church, considers racism to be heretical, right? They name it as a heresy. And I think that's great, but that's a kind of theological response. And one of the things in our previous conversations that we talked about is like, well, maybe it's better to talk about it as like a sin. And that is also a kind of theological response. It's a slightly different, ethnophyletism is their heretical term for it. But what would that look like? And I'll just venture a little bit of a possibility, right? That if we are sort of bound together by a conception of how we conceive of the unity of Christ, right? There would be a sort of impossibility. It would be a sin to sort of overemphasize either the body or the spirit, or to pull those things apart. It would give us a possibility of mounting an answer grounded in that, about why it would be problematic to exclude people based on race, to respond to human beings based solely on the body, because we as Oriental Orthodox Christians insist that you can't pull those things apart so easily. So maybe that is, I offer that just as one sort of possibility, as we go forward to think, okay, I think we're in agreement here that we should do better as Oriental Orthodox brothers and sisters and spend more time together, and that there are sort of historical groundings. But, what could a theological response be that would be shared between us? So that's my first sort of inkling of a thought. I don't know if the other two of you or others out there have ideas on that.
I'm with you there. When I was an undergraduate I was also at Pepperdine there, in speaking to some of the Black theologians who were of Protestant backgrounds there, the way that they typically approached it is, they would call it idolatry. They would say, racism is a form of idolatry. That is to say that they're trying to lift one category of human being above another category of human being. And when you go back to Genesis, right, the kind of famous imagery is, let us make man or humankind in our image and in our likeness, and not like in a few different images and a few different likenesses. The conversation I participated in with the Greek Orthodox folk on this idea centered exclusively on what the Epistle to the Galatians had to say, that it's one of the Pauline texts par excellence that shows how a Gentile community and a Jewish community that have this ethnic difference are supposed to come together. But even if you wanted to center the kind of stories of just the women within the genealogy of Christ, as it's found in the Gospel according to Matthew, you find Moabites, you find Amorites, you find this mix. And so, a lot of people like to skip that because they don't like saying begat 1,000 times. But the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 is so important. The beginning of the New Testament, it starts off by smashing this idea of race. And it draws us back to the unity that we're talking about. I like how you grounded it in our Christology. Actually, the term we use often to describe ourselves, is tawahado, which actually comes from a kind of local council that my brother Chris and I, who spoke earlier about our priests, we did an episode on one of my podcasts kind of talking about that. But a more recent kind of modern local Ethiopian council, we settled on that name to reaffirm this kind of Christological formula called Miaphysitism that goes back to the character of Cyril of Alexandria, whom our sister Candace mentioned earlier. So yeah, absolutely. Whether it's Genesis, whether it's Matthew, whether it is Galatians, I think we have plenty of room to recognize the sin or the idolatry of racism and talk about it together.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I would say that a theological response is quite important from our churches institutionally. I would also say that the only way that is going to be a possibility for us is a reckoning of the kind of structural differences between our churches as well, right? Kind of also historical reparation of acknowledging, whether it be the relationship of the Coptic Church to the Ethiopian Church, or not to start any issues here, but just, I mean, these are really important things for us to think about, right? Or the Syriac Church to the Mount Cara Church and the continued issues that are there. I think that these are important things for us to also address. And what makes our particular union very specific, and what could also offer a richness that kind of gets us beyond the binds of religion and race in American society, the kind of more traditional churches that have kind of tried to think about this question. I think that if we can kind of collectively come together and really deal with our historical contexts and our current political situations, socio-political situations, I think that we can then offer and start to think institutionally about a theological response.
Thank you. Candace, maybe, I don't know if you want to switch over, but maybe we'll stick and take it.
Probably should. And
yeah,
so,
I know you're more of a host than I will see you over there in a little bit. But I'll stick around for a little bit if folks, because I did want to promise people their opportunity to speak and ask questions a little bit as well. But thank you, Candace. Thank you. This has been a great start to a conversation.
Thank you.
But we will leave the floor open, so that just means that Deacon Henok and I now have to bear the brunt. So, if you have questions that you're going to ask Candace, sorry, you got to take them to her at another time. But if folks do have things that they want to get on the record, or responses to what we have said, or things that we blatantly left out that we should have been talking about, any of those things, that if you've got some thoughts you want to get out there, because I mean it when I say that I think this is the beginning of a conversation. Yes, there is scooch. Yes, there are conversations that have been happening between our churches, but I think it's important that not all of them happen at the level of hierarchy, but it's also important that they happen in lots of different ways and places and over different topics. So to me, that's quite important to have that conversation. So it's the beginning of one. So if anybody wants to give us talking points for our next one, have at them. Yeah, Laura.
If I may. One thing, sidebar, because I see Father Vasca and Kazuyan on this call. I tried to post the picture of Bishop Torkom with some of his clergy at the Washington Monument, and it didn't post. I'm really bad at this. But his dad was one of the priests at the Washington Monument on the Poverty March in 1968. I'm sorry, Father Vaskin, I couldn't post it. I really tried. You can see it in chat.
It's there. You just have to download it from the chat.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, guys.
Pretty good.
But, I think one of the things I privately messaged to you, Chris, was theology and et cetera to one side. All the Oriental churches have the shared experience of persecution, which should translate into a powerful empathy. And I think that's a place we can circle around, that shared empathy toward others who are being oppressed. One example, my dad was an orphan of the genocide. Well, every time he would see a picture of orphans from anywhere, he would start to cry. We all have that in our genes somewhere. All of us on this call have that needed empathy within. I think we can circle around that. And I'm just poking around with this other idea that all of our theology is Jesus Christ is a one united nature. Somehow, that has to speak to what we're supposed to be doing on earth. Because at least Armenian theology does not have the concept of two realms, that heavenly, otherly, and worldly. Rather, it's a concept of, there's only one world. It all belongs to God. And can we circle around that theology a bit? Okay, I've just talked too much. I just wanted to kind of get that out, though. especially the picture, Der Vasken, especially the picture.
Thank you for sharing that, Deadeye. It is wonderful. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. Yeah, I think, I mean, I think there is a shared theological response that could be developed. I really do. And I think it's worth pursuing and thinking together about that. So that's an important thing. I know Laura had something that she was going to say.
I really appreciate this, and I'm learning a lot from everyone. Taking Ded Yeprem's example and just bold action or living faith in action. And I think this is one example of just actually getting together, seeing each other's faces, and starting to learn. Like taking the time to learn about each other is very critical. I guess one of our 20 somethings on a call with our youth minister last night said, why don't we look for allies or friends in other Christian churches in times of peace and prosperity? Why is it always in times of need that we're saying, maybe our other Christian Orthodox families will want to support us? Well, we need to somehow maybe examine ourselves a little bit deeply and say, why is it? What is stopping us? I guess what is the bold action that have not been able to overcome? It's very important to understand it, but then it's important to do it. And I guess I'm frustrated with myself that I can't, to move more in the spirit of Ded Yeprem, to just do it, get out there. So that's a challenge for me, but I'm wondering if anyone has anything to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm an academic, so I'm very good at the thinking it and sitting on it, and I'm less good on the acting on it. But I think it's a really crucial point. I think being together, and I think, Deacon Henok, I love it. Let's make sure we, are marching together and working together, and that starts it. I think that starts it. So. I mean, I'm over here now, but my family's in California, so we can make that work.
I know. I used to live in I've lived in Merced and in Turlock, so not too far from where you used to be.
Yeah. Well, any other thoughts? I would maybe in terms of the sort of getting together, Laura. One there was another comment in the chat that I just want to highlight that I think is important about I think. As we build a kind of Oriental Orthodox ecumenical response to this, it's crucial to make sure that we engage other Christian responses to this. And actually, Der Yeprem and I we have a little Armenian group that we've been doing some things with, and we recently read the Cross and the Lynching Tree, which was, if you haven't engaged with Cohn's work, that's a great place. It's one of his newer books, but just powerful stuff. And thinking about how this ecumenical conversation that we're having here is the most natural one in some ways, but that as we build whatever it is we're going to do, it has to be in conversation with all of Christendom, right? Really talking about that, talk about that one body, one body, one spirit, one united nature. I mean, that's what we really ought to be striving for. So I would leave us with that. And I would also just, where Candace went off to, just one more time, a plug for this little group that we've been putting together, the Oriental Orthodox Solidarity Project. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. You can find Candace as well. She's more involved than I am in it, but it's just a practical example of Oriental Orthodox folks getting together, because we do have these examples. I know here in the New York, New Jersey area, there's often youth groups and concelebrated liturgies and things that happen. But I think just getting together on different topics and different possibilities for working together and having these conversations and fellowship together, I think is a crucial part of coming up with a response to the rest of the world and the rest of the country as well. So, Deacon Henok?
Yeah, that's huge. I'll leave with a more complication, because we've often said how it's just the beginning, just to a strange kind of reflection. We've talked about the kind of common persecution that we've all experienced. What makes the Ethiopian situation very strange is that by adopting the blackness of the ADOS, of the African descendants of slaves in the United States, we enter the United States as more of this persecuted, oppressed group within the system as it is here. At the same time, if anyone has paid attention to any of the politics back home, there are some people being killed. There's talks of genocide right now. Bows and arrows, poison darted bows and arrows are being used to kill people right now in 2020 in Ethiopia based off of an ethno-religious identity that you're talking about. And part of that is that in Ethiopia, the Orthodox Christians has actually, since the 300s, since we've received that bishopry from Alexandria, have been the dominant culture, and particularly the Amharic and Tigrinya speakers within that, although the church incorporates much more identities. And especially from 1200 to 1974, it was an Amharic speaking dominant kingdom. And so some of the kind of retribution from some of the other pagan groups, or even some of the other Muslim groups who are also being influenced by more modern Wahhabism or Salafism, to different than the organically kind of the Orthodox, Sunni, and the Sufi groups that have been in Ethiopia since the very beginning of Islam, as one of the kind of first safe ways for Islam, and where for the most part Christians and Muslims have lived side by side, is in response to what they view and what they call the Orthodox Christians of Ethiopia as oppressors. Some people have even taken the language of BLM and tried to flip it and say that the analogy is that in Ethiopia. And I of course find that highly disagreeable, and various people have different opinions on it. But it's just interesting from Ethiopia being the host of, like you said, the last kind of synodal meeting amongst all of us in a dominant culture, coming here and accepting the kind of the mantle of the persecuted. And it's not that Ethiopia was almost extinguished on three kind of big events. One from a ruler who was either a Jewish or a pagan queen, later on from allied Ottoman, Yemeni, and Somali forces, and then later on from Italian colonists. Each time Ethiopia survived, but barely, and had this kind of process of rebuilding. Now that we find ourselves in diaspora, again, after coming to some of the neat conclusions we've got to, I hope that I'm able to leave on this note of complicating the issue a little bit further, but putting that importance on seeing each other's faces and being in conversation. So thank you again for having me, and I look forward to continuing these conversations.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for being here, and thanks for that. That's an important point to have the complications as well. And I won't give myself the last word by saying other complications we could have. I will leave it there because I think that's really important. So, Deacon Henok, thank you. Thank you also to Dr. Candace Lukasik, who left us a little bit earlier. What a wonderful conversation this has been. I think this is really important. I hope that it is inspiring. I hope that it pushes people to think about things that they can do, and I hope that it is a starting point for future conversations and actions and fellowship together. I do. So thank you all for being here. And
Chris, we should add, congratulations.
Oh, yes. True. Thank you, Dead High.
Sure.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Sure. Very good. Well, thank you, everybody. I think it's now evening for everybody, so I could say good evening or good night for everybody on all the coasts. So take care, everyone.